Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the International Solidarity Pod, which is a podcast that aims to explore current affairs and history relating to imperialism, the global south, gender, political economy, and people to people ties. I'm your host, Ashwin. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. We rely on your support. Today, I'm joined by Raven from In Defense of Liberation. We have a pretty wide-ranging discussion touching on, resistance in the global South, in Palestine, as well as touching on a history of global class struggle, among other things. In addition to whichever platform you're watching or listening to this on, you can follow the work I do on Instagram at Journal of INTL Solidarity and on Substack at intlsolidarity.substack.com. If you're listening to this on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a review as it helps get this program to new listeners. Okay, here's my conversation with Raven. Okay, Raven, welcome to the International Solidarity Pod. It's your first time on. We have talked quite a while, for quite some time before this. So welcome on. And can you, just introduce yourself to the audience and maybe tell us a little bit how you got politicized, that kind of thing?
Certainly. And I want to start off by saying thank you for having me on the show. I've been looking forward to this and preparing for it. And I feel our conversations have led us to a good point where we'll be able to have a great discussion today. So, again, thank you. Um, my name is Raven. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm from central New York in the so called United States. I'm the host of a program called In Defense of Liberation, which is a podcast dedicated towards educating about and understanding liberation struggles and revolution. So, very, very excited for today. And how I got politicized is uh, somewhat of a long story, so I'll just keep it brief and say I was raised in a Christian evangelical Protestant family. They were not overtly white supremacists, but many among my family had white supremacist tendencies and beliefs. I was raised in the church, very isolated, very incubated from everything happening around me. And so towards the end of my high school years and going into my early years at the local community college, I started to interact with and meet people who, came from different places in the world, came from very different walks of life. And I had always had this feeling in my heart that what I was being taught as a child was not right. That's not to say that I really resisted much of it, but especially things to do with Christianity pushed me away from my family in some cases and led me down the road of like anti theism and a lot of those content creators. So that's where it kind of started. But while I was in college, I met quite a few people, specifically from Africa and from Latin America, who really helped to encourage me to read different things, to watch different things, and to start really trying to understand how the world functions. And one of those people who I met early on in my high school career actually became my partner, who grew up in Brazil and helped me to see the contradictions and the incorrect beliefs which I was carrying for a long time. So, anyways, COVID hit while I was still going to school. We went into lockdown, and I ended up having to move out of my parents' home, out of my grandparents' home, and I became very fascinated with a program which I know you're familiar with, which is Revolutionary Left Radio. So I started listening to Brett, and that was right when guerrilla history came on the scene with Henry Huckamaki and Adnan Hussein. So their first episode was with Vijay Prashad. It was on his book, Washington Bullets. And so that really sent me down a rabbit hole. I started researching the coups, the takeovers, the assassination plots, the corruption that the US had brought to almost all, if not all, corners of the world. And I really started researching the history of colonialism, imperialism, and began to try to understand what capitalism was. So that was early on. That was when I was much more liberal, much more innocently minded. I had hopes for the Bernie Sanders campaign, had hopes for reformism and attempting to change and adjust the system as it exists. But as many of us have come to the same conclusions, I very soon after this began to realize that capitalism as a world system cannot serve to function for the majority of people on this planet, and that it sees human beings as profits to be made, as capital personified, and from there on, I started joining some organizations, started meeting with people locally, uh, joined a couple of events, and from there, it's all history.
Nice. Yeah, that's interesting. It's always interesting to hear people's politicization stories. Um, you brought up two things. I don't know which one to go with in terms of, moving ahead, but you brought up Washington Bullets by Vijay Prashad. Um, and you know what? Maybe my two questions can be sort of combined together, and we could just riff off of it. But you brought up Washington Bullets by Vijay Prashad, and of course we've had Vijay on the show. Washington Bullets is essentially about American imperialism and the violence it requires. And you were talking about the capitalist system. The capitalist system is not just economic; it's not just flows of value and wealth and resources from the global south to the global north. That flow of resources and value and lives of people, people's lives lost. That flow is not just automatic. It has to be maintained through violence. And of course, um, you know, understanding that makes it a little bit easier to understand what is happening in Palestine, what has been happening, for 70 plus years in Palestine. But of course, more recently, an acute phase of the genocide, which has, which has restarted the war is back. Um, I'd like to hear some of your reflections on this and on the current state of things, how things are moving. But also my second question was you had, you know, um, pointed out the fault line, I guess, between this reformism, as embodied, especially now by, with folks in the US like Bernie Sanders and AOC. There's a lot to say there. And, between reformism and I guess revolution, or something that more fundamentally challenges the system, which is, I mean, essentially what's necessary. Um, how do you look at that fault line, and what conclusions did you come to in realizing the limitations of reformism? Um, yeah, so the two things there on the table. Take it however you'd like.
I'll start with the history and your first question there about Washington Bullets and the militarized, politicized, and social forms of exploitation that occur within capitalism. So if we take it back to the early days of human existence, where indigenous cultures and societies lived primarily in matriarchal societies, primarily more communalistic and collective societies where responsibilities were shared, the land was owned in common, and where people existed to maintain survival together. There was an early break from this communal system, which came in the first form through patriarchal forms of oppression. Alongside this, and why this was able to happen was because in these early societies, it tended to be the non women or the men who operated the tools and had come to domesticate not only land but also farming and the raising of animals. And so they were able to, as a minority, a somewhat smaller minority than the majority of women, they began to dictate and determine how society was to function for the rest of humanity through the use of violence, through the use of exploitation. And so, as human civilization, if we can call it, developed through time, through slave societies such as the Greek and Roman empires, through to the feudal system of landlords and serfs, kings and queens, and what we called peasants, up to the earliest stages of what is referred to as mercantilism, early forms of capitalism. We see that violence was necessary in every instance to maintain the status quo as it was, especially in societies which did not benefit or did not operate due to the interests and needs of the majority. And so, as capitalism came onto the scene and became a world system, this had to be instituted through the sword and through the gun. And so nations throughout Europe who had been warring for centuries began once again to build empires off of the back of colonial subjects, off of enslaved persons, off of genocide and land theft, which led us through many wars of oppression, many colonial structures, and many forms of advancement of that violence. And today, we see that the U.S. empire has only been able to maintain its strength through the violent oppression of peoples, not only here on Turtle Island, but around the world, including but not limited to the assassination of Salvador Allende, the overthrow of the Mossadegh government, the attacks on Cuba, and the invasion at the Bay of Pigs, but also, of course, centuries of genocide and enslavement of Africans, of indigenous people here on Turtle Island. And so, this system we now call capitalism or capitalist imperialism, whatever term you want to use to describe it, can only be maintained as it is through exploitation and through violence, because it is a system which is operated by a very small and ever decreasing minority of wealthy, powerful landowners, corporation owners, CEOs, and the like, who exploit the majority of this planet for profit. And so that system, which requires constant growth, can only be maintained through excessive amounts of violence, which must always escalate or advance in such a way that they are able to maintain the status quo. And to your second question, I'm trying to remember here exactly. Oh, the question of reformism versus revolution. So very early on in my politicization, I started to have difficulties believing that this system could ever be adapted in a way that wouldn't just allow for the same people who had been oppressing the majority to once again swoop in and take power. It was not primarily, but especially advanced that feeling by the loss of Bernie Sanders in the 2020 Democratic convention to Joe Biden, and then eventually Biden becoming president. That only furthered my belief that capitalism has been around for a long time, oppression has been around for a long time, and these people who have been leading the charge know how to do what they're doing. They are not stupid. These leaders are not imbeciles. They are some of the most conniving, some of the most evil, but also some of the most intelligent people that are on this planet because they are able to maintain such a system while also convincing a sizable minority that this system benefits them and that this system is inherently good. And so after listening to Revolutionary Left Radio for a while, listening to the Red Menace podcast, listening to the Red Nation, plenty of others like especially nowadays, the Electronic Intifada, Activist News Network, I began to understand that history exists and we have to look to it. And there are examples of many, such as Mossadegh, Salvador Allende, and others who were killed, overthrown, incarcerated, and deported from their homes, who tried desperately to build a system within capitalism which could adapt and maintain the system in such a way that some benefits could come to the majority of people. And these people were murdered in cold blood, their countries were invaded, their economies were destroyed, their land was polluted, and their sovereignty was stolen. And so, if we look to the example of nations like Cuba, Vietnam, China, the Soviet Union, we see that the conclusion that revolution was necessary was not come to historically by a choice of those who put it into practice, but it was a choice of the oppressors, as Fidel says, to exploit and exterminate the majority, which led the revolutionaries to choose the armed struggle. And I'll just add in parentheses here, revolution, as you said, is a complete and total restructuring of the system from its very core, meaning that everything that has existed under capitalism either has to go into the waste bin of history or has to be used in such a way that it brings into existence socialism. Specifically here, thinking of the state. And lastly, I'll just say that revolution is not a one-time act. It's not the simple picking up of the gun and committing to armed struggle, but it also is everything that has come before and everything that has to come after, such as building a society which is communal, collective, and dedicated to the benefits of the majority because it is the majority who are in power.
That was great, Raven. Yeah, even like, the rundown of the emergence of capitalism, that was super helpful, I think. I think it's important to bring that back into focus and to bring history into focus when discussing um, you know, current events, including the situation in Palestine and Gaza specifically, also the West Bank. But um, yeah, and this historical view, I would say, is very much um, obscured from us. It's hidden from most people, or the the history lessons that we get at school are entirely, well, fabricated
Bullshit.
propaganda. Yeah, there you go. In a way, I mean, in some sense, it is history, but it's history of a particular view, and the view of those that govern and essentially the capitalists, the imperialists. Um, you know, on this, and I do have a little bit more to say on history. I do want to give us a rundown of in that case, okay, if there's been a capitalist history, if the history that we know is either non-existent, because a lot of us don't know history, unfortunately, or if it's from the capitalist viewpoint, then what does a liberatory history look like? A study of history from the view of those wanting to change it and yearning for liberation. What does that look like? I want to give that, I guess, my 2 cents on that. But first, though, I think I do want to read a bit from an article. So Justin Potter, who runs the Anti-Empire podcast, or the Anti-Empire, what is it called? Show.
Project,
Oh,
I think.
project. There you go. So he has a Substack, and there was recently an article, a very interesting article, on the genocide, on the Palestinian genocide, on the situation. I do want to read a little bit from it. So I hope that's fine, and
More
I
than
also
okay.
I don't intend to take too much time. But let's see, I'll have to cut from here and there. But anyway, it starts like this. It says, quote, "It feels intolerable to realize how many of our neighbors are genocidal racists, how many others are indifferent and unmoved, how commerce and trade and normal relations can go on while genocide is ongoing. Our minds are repelled. We're emotional wrecks alternating between panic, guilt, rage, and helplessness. From this place, we write our laments. The world has failed. We have allowed this to happen. We are cowards. These are our human reactions. The lament is necessary to feel the futility of appeals to our elites, who are more rotten than we could have imagined, which we talked about, to feel the futility of appeals to laws that are on the books but that depend on these same rotten racist elites for enforcement. When we tell ourselves that we have allowed this to happen because we are cowards, we are challenging our own courage. How could we not? We share the world with people in Yemen who have said that they will support Gaza even if the sky falls. We share the world with Aaron Bushnell and a growing number of political prisoners. The people of Lebanon had their villages destroyed, thousands killed. The people of Palestine are struggling against a whole West bent on exterminating them. Are we doing enough? It's a good question, a just question. But, my anti genocide friends, we have to focus. We have to accept the reality we are in. We cannot afford illusions about power we don't have. And this is the important line. We aren't allowing this to happen. We lack the power to stop it. I will stop there. And I was going to go on my history rant, but I think there's a lot here to unpack about the level of organization in the West, right? Amongst freedom-loving people. I think we should reclaim that word, right? Freedom-loving people accept freedom for the whole world, for the third world, for the global South, and for of course, working people, in the global North as well. There's a lack of organization. So we cannot stop genocide on the other side of the world when there is this lack of organization. And there are many reasons for that. I mean, primarily, as Marxists as you and I are, um, we understand that between, let's say, immaterial factors and material factors play a dominant role in the global north. We feed on the resources of the global south. We are satiated. There's one can go on and on. There's so much waste being produced in the global north because of how much we actually extract from the global south, and that fuels our material well-being. It also creates a sense of uh, um, um, well, let's say it also affects us culturally in a way, and determines what we think is possible. It means we have a lot more to give up than, let's say, those in Yemen, who certainly, all respect to them, but they've been for like a decade now been, at the receiving end of imperialist onslaught. So maybe I'll give it to you now, Raven. Some of your thoughts on that and on the question of being organized, in the global North, in the West, particularly, I guess, in the U.S., as is in your case.
So I think there's three things I want to mention directly and make sure to expand on, but I'll say them briefly first so we have them noted down. The first is that the conditions that exist in the West have always been tied to the conditions of the global majority of the global South, meaning that the only reason, as you said, that folks in the global north live, as we call them, privileged lives, which it is the case, it is a privilege, is because of the lack thereof of those privileges, of resources, of sovereignty, and of dignity that exists throughout the majority of the planet. The second thing I wanted to say is when it comes to the immaterial factors, such as emotions, psychology, which is material, these all have material bases. But as they become more obscured, more abstract, especially as distance is put between ourselves and the suffering, especially of those in Palestine, those in Yemen, those in Lebanon and elsewhere, it becomes easier and easier to focus on our own survival by suppressing these emotions and by ignoring these realities in order to create our own abstraction, our own obscure and incorrect notion of what our reality is and what is important to us. And the third thing I wanted to say is when it comes to organizing and the lack thereof here on Turtle Island, but in the West as a whole, I think we should also add the caveat that this is not for everyone. If we take the case of Africans, for example, here in the United States, we can see a robust and revolutionary history of struggling against not only slavery and oppression of Africans themselves, but also a struggle against the oppression of other communities who have been exploited, who have been enslaved, who have been slaughtered, such as the indigenous, who as well in Turtle Island also have a robust history of revolutionary struggle. And so I say these three things initially so that I can get them all on the table and work away from them. But when it comes to the case of what is happening in West Asia, we have seen through the sentiments of not only the Trump administration, but many throughout Europe and even in the global South that they have been convinced of or have benefited from this genocide. And the benefits that have come to them can only continue if this genocide persists and if it expands into other territories. And when we look at the grotesque and brutal images and video footage coming out of Palestine today, it brings into the mind of those who are conscious of it that if something like this were to happen, continue to happen in Palestine, or begin to happen again to this extreme anywhere in the West, there would not be a sufficient means to repel it, to resist it, as has come to exist in Palestine. We see in the case of Palestine that resistance is a national effort, meaning that many from all different walks of life, those who are Muslim, those who are Christian, those who are Jewish, those who are non practicing or believe in other spiritual and religious ideas, have come together along with I don't know that we could say the rich and the poor anymore, but there is a class structure in Palestine as well. And there is also other divides which have been created by imperialism and further accentuated by this genocide. But at the same time that this is happening, a unity is being built in Palestine, which can only be seen in a very few other places in the world. This suffering that is happening, this genocide, is bringing people further and further into the reality, which is resistance is the only way out. And this brings me to my last point, which is in the West. I'll speak specifically for where I am in the United States. A couple things are true. One, history does not exist. In the minds of many Americans, there's no such thing as history. History is yesterday, and even that, with the way news cycles work, the way that media functions, even that is lost in less than 24 hours. But if you look at what little conscious awareness exists about the true nature of American colonialism, settler colonialism, and settler imperialism, as our friend who came on the show with you, Phil Henderson, mentioned, uh, it is a expansion of European settler imperialism, and it is the goal of these settlers, whether consciously or unconsciously, to ignore the reality of violence that it takes to maintain this system in order to focus on what benefits they can draw from that history. And so you mentioned that in most of the West, history is not taught, or if it is, it's a certain kind of history that is necessary, as Sakai points out in Settlers, and as Dr. Gerald Horn continuously points out in his writings, in his interviews. It is a necessary tool of settler imperialism that those who maintain on a daily basis this society have to be convinced of the fruits of their labor. They have to be convinced of the necessity for this practice. And so today, what we see in the West is not just simply a failure to organize, but a failure to understand and analyze reality as it exists materially, not how we feel about it, not what we think is right or wrong, but what is true and what is false. And that leads us to the last thing I'll say, which is in the West, organizing does exist, but the goals, the objectives, the structures of these organizations tend to be reformist, and they tend to be unwilling or incapable of committing the necessary practices that would bring into existence a new world. Because, as you said, we have such bountiful wealth around us and lives which are seemingly much better than many around the world, which much of us or many of us choose we don't want to lose.
That's well said, Raven. Um, maybe on the question of resistance, particularly the Palestinian resistance. I mean, where do I even go from here? Well, essentially, the Palestinian resistance represents the sort of the vanguard of the freedom struggle in the world today. Um, the struggle for national liberation has been put back on the table by them. And I think it's worth reiterating for folks listening that as China actually, the representative from China affirmed at the United Nations some time ago that, armed resistance from the part of a colonized people is legal and is protected actually under international law. And I think I'd just like to read the um, the resolution from the United Nations that affirms this, because it's also important for the rest of us to this whole time we're talking about uh, you know, the propaganda of the West, of the capitalists or of the imperialists. And it's easy to get caught up in their narratives of terrorism and condemning X and Y and Z, which have a chilling effect and materially impact people's lives. It's equally important in light of this to be able to defend ourselves against you know some of these accusations that are overwhelming, and to bring back into light the truth of, what has been established in international law. And so yeah, I think this is important for folks to know. The United Nations General Assembly Resolution 37/43 affirms, quote, the legitimacy of the struggle of peoples for independence, territorial integrity, national unity, and liberation from colonial and foreign domination and foreign occupation by all available means, including armed struggle, unquote. So this is enshrined in international law. This is there at the UN. I believe it was the Chinese ambassador to the UN General Assembly, if I'm not wrong. I might have to check that. Um, Affirmed this right, and I think that again, that's important. This is important to know because, as we're saying, organization in the West, getting politically organized in the West, in the global North, um, is something that has to happen and that, increasingly, I think, will shape up. And along that path, having these tools at our disposal, uh, being armed in a way with this kind of knowledge is conducive to that. It's really important as part of that process. And folks may have critiques of international law, saying that, what does it matter anymore? What does it matter today? What, quote unquote international law says, what, the images of officialdom, what does that have to say about society today? Because an actor like Israel is able to, to tear all of that to pieces and completely disregard it. I mean, Israeli ministers, officials are traveling, back and forth to the U.S. That's no surprise. But they've also been flying over the airspace of France and some of these other European countries that, have otherwise seemed to indicate that they would uphold the ICC warrants, the warrants of the International Criminal Court against the likes of Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, the defense minister or the former defense minister of Israel, etc. Um, on that, I mean, I think, I might again rephrase or bring back into view this understanding of history. I'm gonna probably go on my history rant now of
Take it away, my friend.
of again, so again, these are tools. I mentioned the UN General Assembly resolution. That's one tool. Another tool that's important for us to know and for us to I guess resist the temptation of despair, especially in the global north. Again, there's a material basis for us to just sit in isolation and despair and cry, and crying is important, and despair, has its place, but it cannot define the totality of, political action or lack thereof. So knowing history is another tool that's important with that. Again, there might be the tendency to just see defeat in history. Even among the left, there's there are those that talk about the rise of the Soviet Union, the likes of the Soviet Union, China, socialist projects like Cuba. But since the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's all over. We live in the end of history. This is it. We are sort of just doomed in some ways. And those that were socialists, like Cuba, China, Vietnam, they have since had to adapt and revert paths, etc. That is also not to deny that there has been a paradigm shift in the world, but viewing history from the view of those interested in liberation tells a different story. Um, Radhika Desai, who's a Marxist political economist, she has posited that the high point, and this was an interesting, when I first learned about it, this was an interesting view on things, and it really did change my perspective. The high point of imperialism, the peak of imperialism, she says, was in 1914, and I'll go into why. Because and she's sort of resisting dominant narratives that, since the British Empire and decolonization, and then you had the blip where, the Soviet Union challenged the West for a bit, but then the Soviet Union was defeated, and now as I was saying, the U.S. is hegemonic. The U.S. is just, all powerful political and economic force in the world. She is pushing against that and asserting that actually the high point of capitalism and imperialism is not today, is not in the recent period following the fall of the Soviet Union, but rather in 1914. And the reason for that is because until that point, one could essentially say that the whole world was carved up and colonized. There were no nation states, for the most part, in the global south, that were independent. And even if they were indebted. I'm thinking of Haiti here, and I'll come back to Haiti. But after 1914, you had the capitalist crisis that led to the First World War, where the European capitalist powers fought against each other, and in that was able to rise the Russian Revolution, leading to the establishment of the Soviet Union, which was again lasted until 1992. But the first major systemic challenge to the capitalist imperialist world system, one had never seen that kind of resistance to it before. And then she also talks about the 30-year crisis, seeing the First World War and the Second World War as inherently linked together, as part of a capitalist crisis. And at the end of the Second World War, you have the Chinese Revolution, another huge chunk of the world that becomes socialist. And this is where the West really starts to become afraid that now half of the world, the whole East, as they used to say, is red and is under communist or socialist influence, a systemic challenge to capitalism. And of course, in the same period of time, you have anti-colonial struggles fighting for independence or full liberation in a more meaningful sense, across the third world. Between the 40s and 60s, you had the actual rise of independent global South states, starting out with Indonesia in 1945, India, Pakistan in 47, Sri Lanka in 1948, and then going on into the 50s and 60s, where the 60s was really the era of decolonization, or at least political decolonization across Africa. This was a huge challenge to the global North, to the West. And this was, largely due to, organized resistance in various forms across the global South and across, the non-Western world. And when I say this was a challenge, this at an economic level, this was a challenge. Like, Europe had never known modernity without its colonies.
Mm.
400 years, until, let's say, until 1914, you had colonization starting at around 1492, right? In the quote unquote New World. So for centuries, it was centuries of colonization and dispossession and enslavement that even created the zenith of the capitalist system, of the Industrial Revolution, the resources of the global South flowing to the global North. And for once, from the 40s to the 60s, you were having whole chunks of the world being broken off from this system, attaining some form of another of independence and of sovereignty, with the desire ultimately to develop their own productive forces, their own resources, to redirect the gains made, the economic gains, you know, inward toward itself rather than flowing to the global north, to the west, to Europe, particularly at the time. So this was a radical history, where again Europe particularly never knew modernity without its colonies. This was a huge deal. And of course, the West was afraid of this, and the West had to react. They were afraid of their own populations becoming socialist, communist sympathizers, or otherwise, freedom sympathizing people, we should say, because again, communism and socialism has been vilified so much. Essentially, it boils down to the desire for freedom from a system that enslaves in one way or another. This is why the West had to make big reforms. You had the era of of the welfare state in the West, right? This is where in Canada, for example, you get national, healthcare, single payer healthcare. The same thing in the UK. Unfortunately for y'all in the US, not so much the same, but you folks had the New Deal again along racial lines. There's also the question of the internal colonies, to be addressed here as well. But you but I sort of just wanted to go through this, and I know I've sort of taken some time here, but I sort of wanted to go through this, this repositioning or reframing of history from a liberatory perspective that centers resistance and centers, you know, again, the desires of freedom-loving people around the world, uh, to help us better understand the moment today. And sure, since the 1970s onwards, there has been somewhat of a counter-revolution, right? The capitalists and the imperialists have have, responded to these threats from the global south and from the second world, the communist world, the east, and have reoriented the world system in a particular way to continue value extraction from the global south, and from the working people of the world and dispossessed people of the world. But this dialectic, again, it goes back and forth. Nothing is stationary, especially, uh, you know, it is certainly, I hope I've made the case so far that it is certainly not the case that everything is about defeat and doom and gloom and despair and um, you know the ultimate prevalence of the white Western capitalist world, and the rest of the world not being able to respond to it. Um, yeah, I think I'll stop there, Raven. You can take it in whichever direction you'd like.
Well, let me just start with this. Um, if we look to the period leading up to the First World War, so we'll say we'll start at the 1848 revolutions throughout countries like Prussia and other territories in Central Europe that were put down through massive slaughter, leading up to the turn into the 1900s and the build up to international warfare. Um, During the revolutions, which Marx and Engels lived through and wrote extensively about, we saw that the working class, or as they called it, the proletariat, which was only beginning to come into existence at this time as a functioning, unified class of people, not individuals divided up with different backgrounds, but people who were being forced into the same factories, into the same cities, into the same conditions as each other. At the time, the majority of people were not organized, conscious enough, or connected enough to others to sincerely put up a significant form of resistance which could succeed. And so these revolutions were put down in different ways to varying degrees and different periods of time. As we look forward to the 1860s and 1870s, as capitalism began to turn from what we call free market capitalism into monopoly capitalism, more and more people were being forced into the same factories, into the same cities, into the same conditions once again. And we have the first example of a collective, communal struggle winning its first victory in the duration of the Franco Prussian War in the Paris Commune in 1871. And what happened in 1871 was able to be easily defeated because it was quite isolated from the rest of the world. And even the people who participated were not as unified with others outside of Paris as would have been necessary to continue the commune. So the commune was overthrown. Yet again, Marx and Engels write extensively about the lessons to be learned. And the Paris Commune ended up causing the one and only adaptation to the Communist Manifesto. It was a lesson learned in real time through historical struggle by people in reality. And so from the 1870s leading up to the First World War, we see the rise of nations like the United States, Germany, who began to aspire for larger and more connected empires of their own, similar to what England, France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and others had had. And so, yet again, through massive slaughter, exploitation, enslavement, and oppression, more people from more places throughout the world who otherwise would have had no connection, would have had no understanding of what each other were going through, were forced to work together, live together, eat together, struggle together. And so, as we come to the First World War, one of the things I always like to point out about the First and the Second World War is that at their core, these were necessary wars for capitalism to continue and for the empires at the time to maintain the status quo. And so in the late 1800s, we see many wars not only between European powers on European land, but throughout the global south, we have the carving up of Africa. We have multiple invasions into Haiti, Nicaragua, Cuba, Chile, and in Asia as well. We see the invasion by Europe into China, the forceful extraction of wealth from China, Japan, and many of the nations which existed at the time who had tried to isolate themselves from this reality. And so, as we come right up to the door of World War One, we had not only wars between empires, but we had wars of resistance. We have many liberation struggles which we can look to in Africa, in Asia, throughout the Americas, including but not limited to the struggles of indigenous people against colonialism. And I say all this because it's important to understand that World War One and World War Two were not choices that were made by individual leaders. They were necessary wars that had material conditions leading to the outbreak of this warfare, meaning capitalism is a system. As we said already, it cannot be adapted or changed or reformed in such a way that it will not exist through the foundation of exploitation and suffering of the majority. World War One happens. Europe goes to war. And what do they go to war for? Colonies, control over the colonial system. And as you said, 1914 is the height of capitalism because it was the last time that they were able to, without resistance, colonize the globe once again in a new way. Even Europe was to be colonized by America in an economic sense by destroying any sense of sovereignty that European empires had from the West, from America, and bringing it into a more interconnected web of imperialist domination. But alongside that, we saw that the peoples of Africa, the peoples of Asia, the peoples of the Americas resisted with such fervor and with such organization. The Russian Revolution occurred, and they began to build trajectory and velocity towards actually existing socialist projects. And I use that term because, as we know today, many of the socialist projects which do exist have had to, as you said, adapt to the international situation in order to survive. But what came after World War I and World War II, even within those two international conflicts, was a series of losses and a series of failures by the imperialists to fully and entirely dominate the globe as they once did. In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we see a series of failures in Korea, in Vietnam, in Cuba, and to a varying degree as well in Africa. We see the rise of the People's Republic of China in 49. All of these do not only just produce a counterweight to capitalist exploitation, but they also serve as inspiration for more to come, for others to struggle. And they taught, they educated, they organized, they armed many national liberation struggles, many socialist revolutions, which either did not fully succeed in taking power or were overthrown after doing so. But here's the kicker. In 48, when the counter revolution came, the revolutionaries were slaughtered. The majority of those who participated in the revolutions of 48, 49, 50, and 51, if they were not outright slaughtered, they were deported or they were incarcerated. And no one came looking for them. No one came to fight for their release. Many of them were left to die while others tried to survive. But today we see a different story, which is that the counter revolution, which is happening today, and the rise of neo fascism and the expansion of hyper imperialism is a recipe for disaster for the imperialists. They can never again have the full control that they once had over the globe. They can never again dominate over Palestine, over Lebanon, over Syria, even over Iraq, over Iran, as they once did. They are having to try whatever methods are left on the table, and what they are producing is further forms of international solidarity and resistance. Never before in my life did I ever know anyone from Palestine or even what had been happening there. And in the series of just a few years, 2 to 3 at the max, I and many others have come to interact with, learn from, study, and begin to fall in love with Palestine and the Palestinian liberation struggle. Because what is happening in the axis of resistance and what is happening specifically in Palestine is an example that the counter revolution can never fully succeed. They may try, they may slaughter as many people as they would like, they may burn the earth, they may pollute the waters, but it will only lead to further resistance. And the only way that that resistance will not succeed is if we choose instead to look only at the defeats, the failures, and the criticisms of this international struggle instead of learning from history and building something better, which is possible.
That's great, Raven. Fantastically said. Um, we're reaching about an hour, and I've got to go after this. I will briefly say, because I did say I would come back to Haiti. Um, Radhika Desai talks about 1914, as a start of an anti-systemic era in capitalist history. I think there's also something to be said, of course, about the Haitian Revolution in 1804, which started, I mean, this was, Haiti was a slave plantation colony of France's, and the Haitian Revolution in 1804 represented the first, you know, the establishment of the first Black Republic, and that, you can't view that in isolation from what cascaded afterward. The British Empire abolishes, slavery officially in 1834, not too long after that. And then what follows with the American Civil War in the 1860s, essentially on slavery. These ruptures in history, such as the Haitian Revolution, and then, of course, later on with the establishment of the Soviet Union and China, independence and decolonization across the global South, these don't just stay in history. These are not just points in some past that exist in isolation from the rest of history. These are points of rupture that, once established, extend their tentacles, I guess, for lack of a better analogy, into the rest of history and influence events that come, that come along further. You probably can't talk about, you know, uh, uh, something like the Black Panther Party without talking about also the Haitian Revolution. And there are many such examples, of resistance throughout history having ripple effects over time. So I just wanted to add that. Okay, Raven, let's close this out here. Maybe I'll give you the last word on whatever you'd like to say, and then you could tell our audience how to find you and your podcast and whatever else you do.
So the last word is this: organize. And what that means is not simple. There's a lot of roles that we all have to play. It doesn't just mean picking up the gun, but what it comes down to is the willingness to sacrifice everything necessary and to commit to whatever practice or activity will successfully accomplish our goals and objectives of worldwide liberation and socialism for the international working and oppressed people. And I say socialism specifically because for those of us in the West who hear this word and are scared of it, as Fred Hampton says, if you're scared of socialism, you're scared of yourself. People prove to me and others every single day that human nature is not exploitation. It is communalism and it is social organization. And so the foundation is already there. And on top of that, more so now than ever, the conditions exist for us to not only see our own suffering in the lives of the Palestinians, of the Lebanese, of the Yemenis, but also in those directly beside us and those whose struggles go unheard of and unmentioned. Because although the conditions do have variations, our suffering is often the same. And so, more now than ever, people have the ability, we have the resources, we have the conscious ability in human history to come together and fight for the liberation of all. And I'll just finish with this: organizing is hard, it's hard work, but it's work like building a loving home or having a deep connection with a person you care a lot about. It takes effort, but the rewards far outweigh the sacrifices needed to be made. Organize, 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 educate, 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 build, 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 because what we have today might not be enough, but what we had before was not even close to what we have today. And what we will have tomorrow is far beyond what exists right now. And if you want to follow me, I don't know why, but you can find me on Instagram, and you can find me basically wherever you get your podcasts at. It's In Defense of Liberation. But I would just say this: there are many others who are much more committed, much more capable, much more well researched, and much more prepared to present these ideas not only loosely and abstractly, but fundamentally with instruction with conscious awareness as to what needs to go into it. And so I lift up once again Dr. Gerald Horn. We mentioned Radhika Desai. We also want to lift up folks like Vijay Prashad, all those at the Electronic Intifada, Activist News Network, and those on the ground in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Yemen, whose content, whose ideas, whose beliefs, whose struggles are directly accessible, albeit maybe difficult to find. They are directly accessible and they are to be learned from. I'm some white person from central New York who happened to come to the right conclusions. A broken clock can be right twice a day. But I got here because of the struggles, because of the sacrifices, and because of the conversations and connections I made with folks like yourself, Ashwin, and plenty of others who deserve your support, who deserve your respect, and who deserve your listening ears far more than I do. So I'll finish and say all power to the people, all glory to the martyrs, and long live resistance. We will win. It will just take time, but we will win.
Fantastically said, Raven. Yeah, and I'd also, reinforce for the audience that I've listened to In Defense of Liberation and, which is Raven's podcast, and I've learned quite a bit from it as well. Like I asked Raven about her, politicization. And I think certainly In Defense of Liberation has played, a significant role as well in my politicization. So, in addition to, whatever sources that Raven has already talked about, I would underscore In Defense of Liberation as well. Raven has, you know, a particularly accessible way of explaining things that have helped me grasp concepts, and politicize myself further. So thanks again, Raven. It was really great to have you, and I think 1 hour was certainly not enough. We will
Not even
definitely be
close.
doing this again. Yeah.
I would love to do it again, my friend. And none of these ideas originate from my head. You know, I always say this. I can yap, I can find a way to explain it. I'm a gabber. That's what I do. But ultimately, these ideas come from reality, they come from resistance, they come from struggle. And I'm just passing the message on.